All right, welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with Peter Rollins, who's an author, a philosopher, a storyteller, a producer, a public speaker, and has a reputation for overturning traditional notions of religion and forming churches that preach the good news that we can't be satisfied, that life is difficult, and that we don't know the secret. So excited to go to your church there, Peter. looking forward to it.
Unfortunately, it's quite hard to get new converts. You know, most people
right.
They want the answer that everything's going to be okay, so it's a little bit tougher.
Right on. So, yeah, looking forward to this conversation a lot. I've taken some time over the last month to go through your book, Orthodox Heretic. And I'm super excited to go into some of the nuances and some of the details and some of the themes that run through that book. But first, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit about your background and what you're up to right now?
Yeah, so my name's Peter Rollins. You said I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland. I actually am back here. I was living in America for the last 15 years, mostly in LA, but I was also in Connecticut as well for a few years. And you know, funnily enough, that intro that you did, which was lifted off, I think, a book that I wrote a long time ago, which actually kind of does give a key to what I'm about, which is often religion is seen to offer the answer, whether you believe the answer is right or not, but it kind of is there to give you the good news that you can feel whole and happy and content, if not in this life, then in the next life. And I guess a lot of my work is about the theory, but primarily the technology of a type of religious community that embraces contradiction, that embraces antagonism, that kind of is freed from the pursuit of happiness, not free to pursue happiness, but free from that superegoic injunction. And so, yes, that my work has always been connected to that. So I'm very interested in theory, and we're going to talk theory, but I'm actually also really interested in the idea of a type of Christianity that can bring in some of the insights of people like Hegel and Lacan and make that liturgical.
All right. So I'd be interested, before we go into some of the details of the book, to maybe get a little bit about the background of the man, Peter Rollins, and specifically, like, as it relates to sort of what we're talking about on the topic of religion, Christianity, and then philosophical theory. Is what's your history with religion? What's your history growing up? Did you grow up a Christian? Was there a conversion process? I mean, what I got the sense in reading your book that there's some deep search that went on in your life.
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't grow up religious. I grew up in a kind of secular family. My dad was very quietly religious. He had a very beautiful, very quiet faith, so quiet that I didn't even know it existed, and probably until I was about 30. But it was a very deep and abiding comfort to him. But I had no religious background. I am one of those people who, you know, there's a lot of people who just look at the world and they can't help but think about God and kind of believe in God. It's like almost a properly basic position. I'm the opposite. I'm a natural atheist. I just naturally look at the world and don't see anything. And I didn't grow up educated or anything like that. But up until a teenager, I had no conception of this notion of God, no understanding of religion. But then, funnily enough, I encountered some people on the street in Belfast who were doing street evangelism. They were part of the charismatic evangelical church. And over the course of a few weeks, I got to know them. And then I had what would be seen as a very kind of a type of mystical religious experience, got very into the evangelical church only for a few years. And then that's really where my journey began. And then I kind of from there, I never feel like I moved away from that. I just feel like I got deeper and deeper into it and ended up exploring death of God theology and into what I do today.
Okay, and so in your mystical experience and sort of the relationship to the evangelical tradition, what was it that you appreciated about the tradition, the institution, the services, and what was it that led you to convert more into an interest in death of God theology? Did it come from the tradition, or did it come from moving away from the tradition?
Yeah, so at the time, I wouldn't have been able to articulate this in the same way that I might be able to now. But what happened to me is I'll use the term religious experience. And by that, I mean not an experience of something, but that which changes your experience of everything. So, it's not like I had experience of 100 things in the world, and then suddenly I had an experience of another one. So I had 101 experiences. What happened was something that decentered me, destabilized me, and caused me to experience everything in a different way. And the primary experience was of subtraction. It wasn't addition. It wasn't that I started to believe in God or believe in a certain set of new doctrines and ideas, although that came very quickly. The actual religious experience was a sense of subtraction. It was a sense of all of my identities dissolving away. So, for example, I came home to my parents who were sitting having a drink in the living room, and I sat them down and I said to them, "I am no longer your son." Now, I don't know what was going on in me, but I was like, "I'm not your son anymore." And they were probably a bit surprised, but they were very gracious as well. And they were like, "Oh, okay. That's interesting." And then I went into my room and I started getting rid of everything in my room, which was not very much. And this wasn't a St. Francis of Assisi kind of, I want to give everything to the poor. It's just your belongings tell you who you are. And I looked at everything in my room and I didn't know who they belonged to. It was like, it wasn't no longer me. So I started to get rid of my stuff. And I was doing a computer studies course and I dropped out of the course. So the experience was one of radical subtraction. Like what I think I was saying to my parents was, the way you brought me up, much of which was incredible and brilliant and incredible, beautiful parents, but I suddenly felt like it no longer defined me. It was this radical existential subtraction. And that stuck with me. So, of course, the next day I start going to the church and I start getting fed a lot of doctrines, a lot of stuff. But what really stuck to me was that this religious experience was an event of subtraction. And I think that's then what I started to go to university. I didn't have an education, so I had to study to get into university, and eventually started to reflect on this experience and see it as centrally important.
And so now, just because I know from doing a little background research on your education, you moved from, I mean, you basically moved through different strands of philosophy. Is that right? At every level of study. And so in that sense, I'm interested to know about how the mystical experience as this dramatic emptying, self-emptying,
Mm-hmm.
was then leading to an openness to specific religious doctrines, but then a sharpening or a deepening of your religious understanding through philosophy. What ended up being the relationship between your exposure to religious doctrines and your experience moving through the universities in philosophical disciplines?
Yeah, now it's hard for me to describe. I think there were two things simultaneously going on. At a very superficial level, I was a hardcore evangelist. I mean, even after I left that part of the church, my friends would call me the evangelist because I was a bit of an evangelist for death of God theology, But I was out on the streets praying for people, looking for miracles to happen, doing all of this stuff, And in some respects, I remember reading Francis Schaeffer, who some of your listeners and viewers will know. If you have any religious background, you'll know Francis Schaeffer was really the intellectual of the evangelical movement. He wasn't an evangelical himself. Do you know much about Francis Schaeffer, actually, yourself? Have you heard of him?
I've never heard of him.
Oh, you'll be fascinated then. Oh, this will interest you. So Francis Schaeffer, he was he wasn't an evangelical Christian himself as such, but he was very aligned. And any evangelical who wanted to start to think about philosophy would read Francis Schaeffer. And it's funny because he's got very idiosyncratic and weird readings of philosophers. And I don't know if I would rate him that highly, but I was one of those people who started to read him. And he said in one of his books, if you want to know where culture is going, study philosophy. You know, what the philosophers are talking about today will be downstream in 50 or 100 years. So I went to university partly because I already knew the answers to everything. I mean, I was 17 years old and just had a mystical experience. I knew everything. And I went in to just get the kind of the evidence that I required to back up the truth that I already held, you know. And that thankfully was driven out of me. Some of my early lectures and lecturers were very gracious in kind of cracking that arrogance. But the other thing that was going on, and this was the thing that was a little bit going on behind my back, was I was looking for a language to help me tarry with what had happened. And like, you'll know this story because I didn't have any educational background. I didn't know there were two types of philosophy. I didn't know, you know, there's continental analytic. So I fell into analytic philosophy and I did that for a while. And I was like, this is not giving me the language that I want and need. I did it for a year. All of the analytic philosophy of religion was interested in, say, for example, the question of God's existence or God as a being. And intuitively, I was like, this just doesn't seem right. And thank goodness my university had a scholastic philosophy department as well, which is really continental philosophy. And I discovered that, and that began to give me the language to begin to understand and appreciate my experience.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't it's not hard for me to imagine after having a mystical experience to expose yourself to a year of analytic philosophy would just be, sounds a little bit like a nightmare.
Yeah.
It's like we're talking past each other here.
Yeah.
But
it was like a mystical experience when somebody told me there was another type of philosophy. When I sat down with this guy and he went, oh yeah, actually in the same building, there's this group and they're called scholastic philosophers. I was like, what? And that was salvation for me.
Right. I mean, it's super interesting. I might want to dwell a little bit on that. Is, you know, what do you think is going specifically the experience of being a young man who experiences a mystical state and then is looking to sense make out of that mystical? That's a very vulnerable, that's a very difficult space to be in some sense. It can be extremely disorienting, confusing, and you cannot know where to go. So what would be your advice to a hypothetical young guy who was in a similar situation to you? Where would you point them? Where should they go in that situation?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, for me, the event itself was, I'll use the term being born again. I quite like that term actually, because you don't experience birth. Birth opens you up to experience. You know, you don't experience your life. Your life is the window into experience as such. And this event, as I said earlier, it wasn't an experience as such, but it was what transformed my experience of everything. And genuinely, I'm probably a very messed up guy because I don't remember very much of my childhood or even adolescence. But you know, none of it seemed to be that important to me. This event that happened when I was 17 is what really made me think that life had, I don't want to say meaning, I want to say like it became meaningful. I suddenly became thirsty. I sensed, I mean, in one way, because I was an arrogant kid, oh, maybe I found the answer. But in a much deeper sense, it was like, I am having to wrestle with something that saturates me, that I cannot grasp, I cannot understand. And I wanted to find a way to be faithful to that event and to be faithful to it in language and in action. So yeah, advice, that's a good one. We live in this amazing age of people like yourself I was just saying before we switched this on that I think I came across you when you were just starting with the whole YouTube thing, and you were part of this bunch of people. A word I love is, although it sounds like a slag, but I love the term vulgarizer. I think it's such a strong word. And vulgarizer now, people think of it as it means to make base, but actually in the true sense of the term, a vulgarizer is someone who makes stuff accessible to the people, intellectual life accessible. And there's a whole pile of people now on things like YouTube who are providing a way to reflect on these kinds of things that didn't exist whenever I was experiencing this. I went to university, of course, I went to libraries to study, but nowadays people have all of these resources online to try to find some mentors who can help you, who can, I suppose, expand your mind. I don't want to say think a particular way, but give a sense of all the different ways that you can kind of try to start to make sense of that experience. That's a waffly answer, but if I can think of a better one by the end, I will, because that's a great question.
It might come out, let's say it as a background theme, and we'll see if it pops up again, but it's certainly the case that, even when I was first getting into university life and I was first becoming an intellectual, I mean, there were certainly not the resources online that are available today. I mean, it's just basically everything's available today. I mean, basically we can find every book and we can find every lecture, and we can find obscure lectures from Deleuze, and we can find obscure lectures from whoever, so it's really, we're really in and at the same time, the problem is almost like we need more containers that can sort of create constrained experiences that help people to sense make all of this information, if that makes sense. And well, I suppose that's one of the reasons why I tried to do Philosophy Portal. But one of the central concepts in your sort of contemporary sort of public persona or intellectual drive is pyrotheology. So where did that turn? And then there's this symbol you have on your website which has pyrotheology, and it says absurdo confido. Mm-hmm. So where did that term come from? What does it represent? And just sense make around that a little bit.
Oh yeah, that's two great questions. So I'll go with I'll go with pyrotheology first. Then, just when I started to explore these ideas at university, I simultaneously set up a space where we could explore these ideas in liturgical, ritualistic form. So I went to this bar called the Menagerie in Belfast. It was just like this kind of, I wouldn't say paramilitary bar, although it was kind of connected to the IRA. Like they did have an IRA arms find in it, but it was this really cool kind of like grungy bar in Belfast. And I asked the guy, Francie, who ran it, listen, could I do an evening in the pub? And he was like, I said, I'll do it on a Sunday night. And he was like, okay. I said, it'll be music and whatever. And what I did with that first night was just try to find some musicians, DJs, storytellers, and create an environment to kind of like to almost ritualistically explore some of the stuff I was reading. So, for example, at the time I was reading Derrida and deconstruction, post-structuralism. I was reading Jean-Luc Marion and some stuff on mysticism. And so I think the first ever event we did was called Apocalypse. And it was, you went into the bar, there was kind of, through the music and the poetry and the storytelling, we kind of explored this notion of apocalypse. What is apocalypse? But we also wanted people to experience it. So, for example, we did a gathering on the Second Coming, which I always liked, and the gathering was running late, and the doors, we couldn't get into the building on time, and eventually we got in, we got everybody seated, and we had to set up, and we had this quite well-known musician playing, and he was sound checking, and I was having to tell people, listen, we're going to get started, just give us 5 more minutes. And we kept setting up around everybody, and then I got up again and said, okay, listen, we're still getting ready here. We're still waiting for someone, but here, let me tell you a story while we're waiting. So I told a parable. And of course, as the night went on, people realized the gathering not happening was the gathering, right? The second coming, you're waiting for someone to arrive. So we like to play with these kind of experiences. Anyway, one time we did an evening. I'd heard the quote from Bonaventura Duretti, the only church that illuminates is a burning one. And I really liked that, because I thought, oh, there's a double meaning there, which is, the explicit meaning, which is burn the churches down. But there's also, of course, the burning bush and the idea that something can burn to give light. So we did a gathering called Pyrotheology, and we all dressed in burnt clothes, and we had this funeral pyre and all of that. And really, it was a friend of mine, a psychoanalyst, came up with the word pyrotheology for the night. And after that, I thought, I'll just start using that term to describe what we're doing. And it's kind of stuck from there. And we call the events transformance art events. So that's what, so that we had the transformance art events, and then pyrotheology was the kind of theory of it. Now that connects actually with the logo that I used, that kind of faith in the absurd. I'm borrowing that. So famously, Tertullian said, I believe in, now there's always this debate about whether he really said it or what exactly he said, but basically he said, I believe in I believe in Christ because it is absurd. I believe in the death of Christ because it is absurd, right? And really interesting, because people often think Christianity is true because it's not absurd, or it's not true because it is absurd. But Tertullian's basically saying it is true because it's absurd. I believe precisely because of the absurdity. And I really like this, and I changed belief to faith. And this is connected partly to Kierkegaard and others, but the idea that what if faith is a way of living in contradiction and absurdity. So faith in the absurd is kind of the tagline of pyrotheology. It is a type of faith that embraces the kind of Camus' absurd.
It's hard not for me to reflect on probably one of the most powerful experiences I've had, which seems to be intensifying specifically throughout my 30s. I'm 36. Throughout my 30s, is just precisely reconciling with how absurd adult life is. It's like you just constantly confront such weird situations, and situations that are just so disorienting for your spontaneous rational cognition, that it's like you have to positivize the absurd. Mm-hmm. Almost, it seems almost like not, I wanted to say for survival, and on some level it is for survival, but on a certain level, if you positivize the absurd, and I'm certainly not, the incarnation of the affirmation of the absurd, not yet anyway. Okay. But you can thrive in the absurd. I can definitely see that you can thrive in contradiction, and if you can approach it in that certain way, and it's almost like well, it's interesting that a psychoanalyst gave you that term because of the famous Freudian dream, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" Uh-huh. I don't know if it was directly connected to that, but it's kind of like that feeling is like you're burning, and there's no one to hold the fire. But it's almost like you just have to positivize the inner burning.
Yes.
How do you relate to that reflection?
No, absolutely. The insight that is most precious to me, that others helped nurse me into, was somehow in me from the beginning, right from that, when I was 17 years old and I had that experience, right through to Icon, the Transformance Art stuff. There was something in me that felt that unknowing and antagonism and even contradiction are part of life. And it took me a long time to find theorists who helped me kind of like articulate that in a way that I think was the kind of really useful to me. But so much, and comes back to the introduction you gave to me, where if you take kind of a confessional church or I'm thinking of a secular world. I lived in LA, the most religious place in the world. Everyone is offering you wholeness and happiness in every corner. Take DMT, do CrossFit, do yoga, have money, fame. It is the mecca of the religious world. What I would call after Todd McGowan wrote a really great book called The End of Dissatisfaction, and he talks about the God of the demand to enjoy, which is, I think, the God of the contemporary world is the God of the demand to enjoy. We used to have the God the God of castration, I would say, where there's the God who says you're all castrated, you're all alienated, with one exception. Now, that one exception was sometimes the lord or the lady who lived down the street, but the exception is God. God is the uncastrated one. The rest of us are castrated. And that creates a certain solidarity because we're all castrated. But today we live in the age of the God of the demand to enjoy, where none of us have to be castrated. It's an illusion, or it's something you can overcome. And it just makes us hate other people and be jealous of them and envious of them, creates a lot of social friction. So we live in the God of the demand to enjoy. What my work is about is, and I think what happens then is the God of the demand to enjoy is so anxiety producing that we end up trying to find new rules, new masters. So Lacan famously said to some student revolutionaries, you look for a new master, you will have one. I saw this in LA. I've seen this in myself, that and this is what Lacan means when he, I think, kind of like has a playful dig at Sartre, who in his famous essay on existentialism and humanism says, without God, everything is permissible, quoting, something of Dostoevsky. And that's really interesting, the idea, of course, that if there is no objective law, then, there's things that they think are good or bad, but everything is possible. And then Lacan playfully says, no, without God, nothing is impossible, or sorry, nothing is possible. And without God,
nothing is permissible.
Yes, nothing is permissible. Thank you. And what I saw in LA, for example, is the more freedom you have to sleep with anybody you want, you can go out, have a great time, have sex with whoever you want, do whatever you want. More and more people stay in and see nobody and are dating nobody and having sex with nobody. And it's a real weird irony where under this, that there's an anxiety that's produced precisely through this sense in which everything is possible, so much so that some people end up going to conservative churches, not because they believe in it, but because it's easier to date. It's easier to find with these rules and constraints. So some people are trying to find the God who castrates again. But for me, the answer, and this is what I'm interested in Christianity, is a God who is castrated as well. That instead of there's like an exception to castration, which is, say, God, or somebody, as I say, who's a multimillionaire who you think has everything, or the idea that none of us are castrated, that you can be all you can be, you can optimize your life hack, do everything great, which creates all these symptoms like fatigue and burnout, ADHD, etc. What we need is a God who is also castrated. In other words, castration or contradiction is all the way down throughout everything. So there is no wholeness and completeness. The wholeness and completeness is a type of retroactive fantasy that arises from the fact that actually asymmetry is at the very heart of everything. And for me, this is the central insight of my God, why have you forsaken me? The self-divided God, that God is divided as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the middle of I mean, there's a lot there to reflect on, but I'm in the middle of teaching the science of logic, and that's something that Hegel makes quite a few pretty strong remarks about in regards to the idea of God as this, like, he's specifically critiquing some of the philosophical notions of his day as regards to God as this notion of the sum total of all realities, which escapes contradiction and which escapes, which basically is the whole resolution of the drama of being, or the drama of existence, and precisely to articulate a sort of philosophical worldview, which is logically grounded in contradiction itself, including God.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
but it's a super. And then there's so many other interesting things that you said there. I'm almost tempted, like, it's the first time actually I've ever thought about LA as the Mecca of the religious world. But specifically, I think maybe I think it might be helpful for the viewers when you're talking about a God that demands you enjoy versus a God that used to be a God that almost demands your castration. We're talking here, I'll just throw it back to you, but we're talking here about the superegoic injunction. So yes. like this God as a superego is like, I've had this experience and I tried to rebel against this experience a few times, where it's like, it's New Year's, we should be enjoying ourselves on New Year's, or it's your birthday, you have to be enjoying it's your birthday, or it's Christmas and we have to enjoy that it's Christmas. Why aren't you happy that it's Christmas, and so forth? These types of things are the God that demands we enjoy. Versus yes. Like my granddad would tell me stories. My granddad grew up in Ireland, in Dublin. Yeah. And he would tell me stories about how, kids would basically there would be basically the superegoic injunction from adults is like, you better never be enjoying. Like, why are you happy? So it's like precisely the reverse. Yeah. Did you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I've often thought, so, they say, it's probably not true, I don't think Freud ever said this, but said the Irish can't be psychoanalyzed. And I love this phrase, I love this idea. What I think is true in it, even if he never said it, is that potentially in Irish culture, the kind of like suffering and the dark and despair is so much intertwined in our art and in our blood that if if part of psychoanalysis helps you realize that you enjoy your suffering, and helps you realize that you enjoy the obstacle that prevents you from enjoying, and that somehow you need to come to terms with that dimension. I go, okay, well, maybe, the Irish, like, because we don't really get caught up in this superegoic demand to enjoy. Mind you, it probably goes to the opposite, where it's like if you try to do too much, you get attacked in Ireland. It's a very different culture. See, I'm having culture shock now. I've just come back to the place.
Yeah, it's got to be weird going from LA to Ireland and back.
Yeah.
And I think it's also worth our time to bring up the other thing you were saying about in sort of a world without God, Lacan's point that a world without God, nothing is permissible, and then connecting that to the increasing sexual frigidity and the difficulties in dating that people are having. Because one of the central points I'm trying to make in teaching the Science of Logic course is that Hegel makes perhaps a poorly known remark in the opening of the Science of Logic, that the reason why logic is so important, and the problem with living in what he calls the twin forces of scientism and pragmatism, getting rid of metaphysics, is that actually we lose the capacity to mediate our instinct. And so in a world where logic has just become disembodied logic, or become something of you don't even need to worry about logic, actually we lose the capacity for sublimation. And his thesis that logic is metaphysics and metaphysics is logic is basically the problem of, well, what the traditional religions were a mediation of instinct. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense. Your point, I thought, was very profound, that people will go to conservative churches precisely for the perhaps unconscious, perhaps conscious reason. Look, it's easier to date. I've had people that have said that to me, is that when they're looking for a religion, or they've tried to explore a religion, it's precisely on the grounds of, I'd like to set up a married life, or I'd like to set up a long-term romantic life. And I can't see how that's possible in the landscape of pickup artists and online dating and apps and swiping culture is just not possible.
Yeah. The people I know in LA, so I got to know some people in LA who are, you know, like they're very successful in their careers in terms of like often personalities, you know, YouTube and comedy, stuff like that. And what's amazing is these are the people who you would imagine have the most opportunities to be having friendships and relationships and having all of the fun, right? Whereas maybe where they came from, small town America, that's where you're repressed. That's where you can't do stuff. But the crazy thing is, it's like the people I know in LA who almost the more famous and the more opportunities and the less restrictions they have on their lives, the more they're suffering from all kinds of symptoms that are preventing them from going out into the world, the more isolated they are. And actually going back to the supposed small town where everything's repressed would be the easier place, as you say, to have a relationship, to have friends, to have actually a rich life. So it's counterintuitive. And yet, as soon as we hear it, I think we also realize it's so true. It's initially counterintuitive, and then you go, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense in some bizarre way. And I think Lacan, again, put his finger on the pulse of that strange problem. Which means that fascism is always a danger within progressivism. For me, fascism is the truth of progressivism, really. But progressivism creates such a level of anxiety that it either becomes oppressive itself, or simultaneously people go back to more oppressive systems.
Oh, I think that's another really important point there, and it's something that came up a little bit in my discussion with Isabel Millar on her book, where we were talking about, you know, the dangers of any progressivist notion, especially a naive progressivist notion, you know, that things are just going to get better and we're just on some sort of linear trajectory upwards or something like that. That actually, I like the way you framed it, is almost like either the conservative reaction or the fascist reaction is the truth of progressivism in some sense. Could you go into a little bit about how you read that into our contemporary culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's another reason why I moved home. It's not a major reason, to be honest, but I saw certain kind of trends within contemporary culture that I kind of just find difficult and concerning. I mean, a lot of it was to do with the types of symptoms that are being created by contemporary society, by what, you know, Byung-Chul Han calls achievement society, the society in which you're told that you can do anything, that you can be anything, that you know, optimize your life, seize the day, you know, everything is positive. Everything's positive. There's no negation. There's no place for laziness, right? I'm a big fan of laziness, which is very different from fatigue, right? Fatigue is, I think, rife, which is kind of like what people feel when they have this constant superegoic injunction that you mentioned, this constant kind of like, you become your own oppressor, you're your own entrepreneur of the self, creates a lot of burnout. Laziness is great because laziness is non-productive time, you know, and I love that. Like the hilarious thing about LA, man, is you can't even get wasted without it having to be for productive reasons. Like people don't just take drugs in LA, they have to take drugs to meet God or to be better, you know, in a relationship, to work something out. I mean, it's unbelievable. Like it's hilarious, the idea of doing something for pure destructive reasons, right? Like in Ireland, when I come back here, we just go out and get drunk. We don't call it the water medicine. Oh, we're going to go out and take the water medicine and whatever. It's like, oh, I'm going to get wasted and eat really rubbish food. And it's like, there's something inherently destructive that non-economic about it. Whereas in LA, everything is filtered into economy, into kind of what you can get out of it and all of this. It's quite a hilarious experience for me. Why was I saying that? We have pure positivity, all of the symptoms that arise. Oh yeah, so I think we're seeing lots of problems with this kind of thinking, both in terms, I think even some kind of autistic symptoms, ADHD, burnout, fatigue, all of the symptoms that we see that are really on the rise today, I think are partly connected with the anxiety that this progressive system generates. So yeah, Is there anything in that? I could waffle on about that a little bit longer.
No, I think it's yeah. I mean, I think it's just another important commentary on our culture. But there is this situation where, and this is something that's personal for me because I'm trying to navigate what I perceive to be the increasing irrelevance of academia, and at the same time being an academic and an intellectual, and kind of finding myself, without having the explicit goal of wanting to be an entrepreneur, finding myself in an entrepreneurial space and needing to navigate that, and having experience with burnout and having experience with how to make room for all the aspects of my life that make me me, while at the same time, as it were, surviving and thriving in an entrepreneurial type of environment. And I think a lot of people are basically encountering a lot of negativities here, like in sort of you have the I never really had the pure affirmation anything is possible, but I know that's very much in the ideology, like just this affirmationalism, which I take to be kind of Deleuzian. But this affirmationalism, which is just, no negativity is allowed. And that's sort of why, in sort of becoming an entrepreneur, like the concept of self-relating negativity is becoming important for me, because it's like kind of like constantly trying to stay attuned to the positive opportunities and the affirmations that are possible, while at the same time trying to navigate the negativities that will inevitably arise in your sort of in sort of your process. And there's no like models or handbooks for this. Like even like when I look at what you like, well, for example, like when I was like doing research on you, like you were one of the first people I've come across where I'm like, there's a guy who's more advanced, older, more experienced than me, who has walked an interesting line, which is not necessarily an institutional line. And so in some sense, that's like, oh, there's like a little bit of a model there, like where I can learn something from, it's basically, you feel like you're in the abyss and there's no model to help. Like, because when you're in the institutions, like if I was like in a university, you would have, well, you could model yourself on the professor, the other generation, and you can sort of see but those models are just breaking down, it seems to me.
Yes, no, absolutely. And like, I feel, and you're probably in the same boat as me, like I that works for me. I mean, I've never worked in a university. I'm very much a kind of an entrepreneurial type guy, I suppose, in some respects, or just like to do my own thing. But the negative side of this society that we're living in is, Herbert Marcuse talks about this, I guess, in One Dimensional Man, but that in the past, if you're working for, say, a university or whatever, you can feel your alienation. You do a job and you don't like it, but you still do it. And the fact that you do the job that you don't like allows for the possibility of a little bit of friction in you that can potentially birth into something, a revolutionary subject or whatever. These days, not only do you have to do your job, you have to like it. Like Facebook wants you to not just work for them, but go on their retreats, wear their t-shirt and really love it. And in the same way, we're supposed to love our entrepreneurial life. And we're kind of like, almost we become, the alienation is no longer subjective. We don't subjectively feel it because we're kind of told that we're living our life and we're doing what we want to do and we're seizing the day. But the alienation becomes objective. It becomes manifest in our symptoms. So, we've got loads of entertainment. We can, we can set up our own YouTube channels. We can kind of do our own life. But what happens is we're still alienated. We just don't know it. And the alienation comes out in various destructive ways. And I see that happening a lot today, is that it's like Zizek's great example of, he says, like a traditional parent will say to their kid, you have to go and see Granny today. And if the kid says no, they'll say, listen, get your coat on, get in the car, you're seeing Granny. And the modern progressive parent will say, little Johnny, get in the car, we're seeing Granny. Little Johnny says, I don't want to see Granny. And the parents will sit him down and go, no, you really do, don't you? Like, we know that you love Granny and you want to do that. And Zizek brilliantly says, this is even worse. Not only does he have to go, but he has to like it, right? There's no inner space for rebellion allowed. And of course, it's only which is Lacan says in the Kabbalist discourse, it's only a ruse anyway, because if little Johnny says, no, I'm just going to play the PlayStation, the parents will revert back to the authoritarian anyway. So, Facebook wants you to enjoy the job and like it, but beneath them, they're still the authoritarian people who'll fire you if you don't. So we live in this very strange place where we're not even allowed to feel alienated anymore.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, even in my childhood, I still lived in a situation where if I was playing too much Nintendo and I didn't want to go see the grandparents, I was like, no, you're getting in the car, you're going to see the grandparents. I want to play Nintendo.
And it creates an inner space. It creates an inner fortress where you can imagine you can imagine when you're old enough, you can do what you want. Yeah. So that creates something, yeah. Whereas whenever you're told that you are, and this, I worry about this for young people. This is not a well thought through idea. I just thought about it yesterday, but I do think that today, large capitalist institutions and the government are kind of countersigning all the rebellious dimensions of teenage life. They're kind of like saying, yeah, we think that's great, and in fact we're up for that, and so what weirdly happens is the big other is not something that teenagers can fight against. So say a teenager's kind of experiencing, like they're going through gender fluidity, and they're kind of like experimenting with different genders, and they're trying to piss their parents off with it, and they're trying to kind of like find some distance. But then the authority figure is exactly the God of the demand to enjoy, going, not you shouldn't do this, which is sometimes what you want, right? Rules are not there to be obeyed, rules are there to be broken, right? But the authority isn't giving rules that you can even break. They're kind of like, it's a superegoic conjunction of saying yes, yes, yes. And in this realm of pure positivity, I think we miss something very radical.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like the first connections I'm making there is like the appearance of a lot of woke culture being sort of rebellious, like for example, like the LGBT movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, but like you can buy like Black Lives Matter t-shirts at Walmart, or like your local bank has a LGBT flag.
Yes.
It's like exactly. The rebellion is immediately commodified and sucked up into the system immediately,
because in the past the system always finds a way to eventually commodify, but that's the trick, that's the dance, is you have a youth culture that really screws up and fights and breaks. Eventually it's monetized, but by then you've moved on to something else. What's happening now is kind of almost in advance, the structure is countersigning what is seen as the countercultural movements, and that is fascinating. I mean, if I said, like, you've got one extreme here, which is the rule, people who like rules and they like to obey rules, right? And there's people who get enjoyment from that. And then there's the idea of get rid of the rules, less rules, kind of like be free. That maybe the third position is, no, you need rules not to obey, but precisely to break, right? That's the point. And I think that's the Lacanian point, is that the point of rules is not necessarily to obey them. The point of rules is it gives you something by which you can experience alienation within your own particularity that can allow you to become a singular kind of subject. And whenever that's undermined, it almost seems psychotic to me.
Yeah, I mean, just in the outlining of those three positions, to me, is like the difference between, like, at least for my interpretation, is like we have a philosophical generation that has not worked through Hegel and not worked through dialectical processes. And we have a generation of people who have been exposed to a sort of non-dialectical affirmationalism. Yeah. And I think that this messes up that relationship that you were just describing about, which I think is also in Lacan, of the sort of the import, like what is it? It's been coming up a lot lately, is like the non-duped heir. Mm-hmm. Is like this idea that you need the transcendental illusion to be duped. Like that the person who doesn't have the transcendental illusion is more duped than the person who has the transcendental illusion and gets duped by it. And you need that sort of process. You need to go through that process. Like maybe even we both, I mean, I could go to my story, but like the story you told of yourself with your relationship to the mystical experience, the doctrines, and then going through philosophy is almost like going through
Some
sort of duping process which you could overcome.
Yes. You almost like the death of God for me is universal because everyone constructs the God that then has to die. And the problem with, and I know Todd McGowan, you talked about this in the last thing, but I find this very interesting, is one of the potential issues with psychotic structure is that it doesn't undergo the death of God because God hasn't been established in order to die, and there's something that has to be gone through, and the perverse structure is similar. But there's a sense in which, for me, when Nietzsche talks about the death of God as a type of salvatory event that we all must pass through, it's kind of like, there's no getting around it. You kind of almost have to set up the God, or the God is set up in order to die. Yeah,
it's fascinating. And I think now I'd like to go specifically into your book, The Orthodox Heretic. And of course, it's been a while since it's been published. So one of the reasons I want to go into this is that I want to ask you about some of the themes that appear and reappear in that book. And perhaps also just will be interesting to see how you reflect on these themes, since it's been published. And I want to start with the end of the book, because the very last, I have this thing I like, which I like reading. I like paying attention to the last paragraph of a book, because usually there's something really good there. And I think it was true in your book as well, which is your last sentence was super powerful and is, so you say, basically trying to articulate the difference between orthodoxy and Orthodox heresy. So you say, the difference between orthodoxy, in which we can dogmatically claim to have the truth, and the Orthodox heresy, in which we humbly admit that we are in the dark, but still endeavor to live the way of Christ the best we can, end quote. Yeah. So just this distinction, I think, is really important. And what does this mean for you? And what did it mean for you then? And does it mean the same thing for you now?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that book, I wrote that a good long time ago now. And I think my books kind of chart a journey. And my very first book was really about the mystical tradition. So from the very beginning, I was interested in this notion of doubt and unknowing, definitely. In fact, my tagline of my original website was "To believe is human, to doubt divine." And I was very interested in the mystics and the notion of something, and even the word thing is an issue, so some event that subverts us, that saturates us, that decenters us or short circuits us. And that is kind of something, almost the signifier God is a unique signifier in a way. It signifies something that cannot be signified. It's a type of like a signifier of a type of doubt and unknowing. But where my work went with that is, at first it was almost like that more traditional mystical idea that there is a reality that we cannot know. So almost an epistemological humility, through to an ontological humility, through to the idea that unknowing isn't simply some failure of the human. Our unknowing is actually an insight into the very nature of reality itself. So that's the movement. And I think Orthodox Heretic is probably a book that sits somewhere in the middle of that transition from one to the other. But it was definitely a book where I was trying to articulate a type of dialectic logic in a way that was super easy. Like, you didn't have to explain it, but just people felt it. Like, I think parables are incredibly great at a type of dialectical thought. They're the counterintuitive insight. They're really structured like a joke. You really have like a narrative and then a counter narrative, and it kind of spins you on your head. And it doesn't so much tell you what to believe as in shifting and reconfiguring what you already assume to be true. So the Orthodox Heretic as well was for me an experiment in not explaining something, but just kind of doing it through these stories.
I mean, it's such a paradox of the term, I suppose, but of course, in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, he ends it with the chapter absolute knowing. But it's like this actually this idea absolute knowing is like empty of all content. Like it's precisely like not an object of knowledge in some sense. In some sense, it's just the empty subject itself.
Yes.
But and that sort of what stuck out to me in your reflection at the end of the book is sort of this juxtaposition between sort of having the full truth, knowing you have the full truth, versus trying, failing, and failing better to be something like Christ, is kind of like a theme that runs through your book. And how does that resonate with you today? This sort of trying to live up to an idea of Christ or the way of Christ, and failing, but failing better, or failing and the best you can.
Yes. So I think what happens to me mostly maybe after that book is, like, I suppose I was interested in your discussion of Girard with McGowan, and maybe we'll come into that because I'm interested in Girard a little, but is what does it mean to call oneself a Christian? And in that book, the thing about that ending, which is interesting to me, is I'm partly kind of going like, you want to kind of, to some extent, I'm almost saying, you don't know what the right thing is to do in a way, but maybe in a Kantian sense, you feel an unconditional call, an ethical call to try to live into that, never knowing quite if you're doing it, and fear and trembling get almost like an existential experience of trying to be good in the midst of not knowing exactly what you're doing, which I like that existential dimension. But for me, the most interesting thing about Christ, particularly the crucifixion and this notion of crucifixion, is that we encounter in Christ a divided God, a sense of a self-divided other. And if the Christian is someone who symbolically identifies with Christ and in Christ's death, then there's something about what it means to be a Christian is to fundamentally embrace and live into contradiction. Now, I think that is in the Orthodox Heretic, but that's how I would describe it now, which I think is kind of like not 100% what I was saying in that book.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can definitely see how that idea is in the Orthodox Heretic, but maybe not explicitly expressed, but it's certainly expressed in a sense of, I mean, the way you open the book with this emphasis on parables being sort of this way, like you've already pointed towards having this dialectical structure, but parables having this way of saying the unsayable, which is already kind of like a contradiction.
Yes.
Is you're trying to say the unsayable. It's sort of like, this knowledge, which is the contradiction itself.
Yeah, and there's something in something in that book. I don't know if I say this in the book or not, but there's actually one of the parables is based off a dream I had, and for me, it's a very central dream that I had when I was in my mid to late 20s, where I dreamt that when I was walking home, I experienced everything dissolve away and God speak to me, and God said, "I do not exist." And this was a very, very kind of like, for me, important kind of moment in my life. And I have a story in there about a philosopher who God appears and says, "I do not exist." But that dream, which is I say, I made into a parable in that book, was a turning point in a sense, an experiential turning point where it's not God exists or God does not exist. God says God does not exist. And that is very much in the Orthodox Heretic. And that dimension of the book, and there are a number of parables that play on that, you do start getting the sense of God as divided. And so that's the moment, that's the bit of the Orthodox Heretic that really I take on.
Yeah, no, it's just a funny joke there between the opposites of does God exist, does not exist. No, it's God says God does not exist.
Not exist, yeah. And for me, that's the end of God theology, which is brilliant. For me, that's kind of Christianity. Like that for me is the innovation of Christianity, is that Christians don't believe in God. Well, loads of people believe in God, like whatever, 70% of the world or 90%, who knows. But Christians believe in the death of God, right? That's the interesting, to believe in the death of God. Now, the truth is, I don't think confessional Christianity does really believe in the death of God, but technically, and this is why I think Hegel is the next Reformation. I think Hegel is a Thomas Aquinas figure, but it never really happened yet. But it has to happen. Is that the next iteration of Christian religious life, if it is going to happen, it should be Hegelian, and it is a kind of embrace of fundamentally the death of God, a liturgical structure based on this notion of contradiction at the heart of God, in God's self. This is actually where I think I'm different from Girard. This is what I was thinking when I watched your interview with McGowan. I haven't read a lot of Girard, so this is more kind of just an intuition. But is it Girard brilliantly, as you know, he argues that the original sin is kind of desire. Desire is always intertwined with jealousies and envies, obsessions and rivalries, right? There's no desire without that, because, as Girard shows, our desire is woven into the desire of the other. So our desire isn't pure. I don't have pure desires. When I start going out with somebody new, I start to desire what they desire. I start to take an interest in things that I never took an interest in before. I mean, in a way, they don't find something in me that no one else found. In a way, it's much more beautiful than that. They make me into somebody new, right? It feels like they're uncovering a deep desire that I had, but really, they're forming a new desire in me, and it's wonderful, but also then creates problems, right? If you start fighting over your music collection, if you break up or whatever. So Girard has this sense, and of course then he says that the violence that desire brings up is then temporarily resolved through a scapegoat, someone we can blame, get as the obstacle we get rid of. And then in Christianity, my reading of Girard, to say, as kind of somebody who hasn't gone too deep, but is that in Christianity, this scapegoat mechanism is revealed, right? So the scapegoat that we think is guilty is innocent. There's God. We've scapegoated, and then we have, I guess, in a sense, instead of being unified around the catharsis of murdering somebody, of destroying somebody symbolically or literally, symbolically is what we do today, but we are, I guess, unified around a shared guilt. It's like, oh my goodness, we have projected onto this innocent our own violence and destruction. That's all very good and well, and I think that's very insightful. But the deeper insight, and I don't think this is against Girard, I just don't know if it's in him, is the Lacanian notion that at its core, the other person does not know what they desire, right? Now, that's in Girard, of course, because desire is mimetic. No one really desires. Everyone's desiring because of everybody else. But what we're really interested in is not the object that the other person desires. We're interested in their desire as such. We're interested in that kind of
object patia is not an object. It's the object cause of desire. It's not an object. Object patia is a lacking object.
Exactly. That's it. And if Girardian could come back on this, but I think you've put the nail on the head. Is Girard kind of says, I desire the object you desire, and kids do that, joint attention. I look at what you're looking at and I start to desire that object. But Lacan goes at a more fundamental level. It's not the object that you desire. It's this object cause of desire. And then the solution, and this is why I'm interested in Christianity, is I think it offers a better salvatory model in Girard, because it's not simply that we acknowledge, oh, I'm putting my violence onto somebody else, right? So I desire things, society, violence erupts, scapegoat mechanism solves it, and then eventually we discover the truth of the scapegoat mechanism. The problem with that is it still leaves something intact. For me, the salvatory moment is when you realize that the other doesn't know what they desire either, that that there is a dimension that the other can never be satisfied. Not only can I never be satisfied or whole or complete, neither can anybody else. In other words, neither can God. If God is incomplete, then incompleteness is in everything. And then, of course, the big insight from that is, and that's wonderful, that's good news. Like, this is my thing of like, I jokingly said, the church of bad news, the church of you can't be happy is not going to be grow. But the truth is, if the good news that you can be whole and complete and happy and content is bad news, but the bad news that that life is full of suffering and sacrifice and you're incomplete, that's great news. If you can embrace the rupture and because that's where enjoyment there is no meaning without sacrifice. There is no and that's why even I had an issue. A friend of mine from America came over to Ireland, and there's a thing in Ireland where, especially for Americans, at first, as you go into a bar, you'll always get bought a drink, right? My Irish will just buy you a drink, buy you a drink, buy you a drink. But my mate, he's been here a few times, and he was always just getting drinks bought for him, and I had to pull him aside and go like, listen, man, the thing is, it's not just the Irish are really generous. It's like, you've got to buy a round back at some point, right? He just thought, this is the Irish. I go like, no, you have to, it's not an exchange, but it's not a complete gift. It's a gift exchange, right? So all societies have like rituals where you give a gift without return. But you also have to, bring a bottle of wine to a party or whatever. There's the gift exchange that goes on. And, oh yeah. So then the reason why all society...
It's implicit.
Implicit. Yes.
Yeah, it's implicit.
And almost there's your man Graeber, remember, as it David Graeber wrote
David Graeber, the anthropologist. Yeah, Rest in peace.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And his book on debt is just incredible. That's a real loss to the world, his death. He has a story in that book, and if I can remember it right, it might be like, let's say it's an Aboriginal story or whatever, about a village where everybody, looks after each other and gives each other fish or whatever. And one guy just keeps taking but never gives. And then eventually one night they slit his throat, right? They kill him. And I think the point of the story is, it's easier to kill someone than to articulate the gift economy, right? It's like, and I felt that with my mate. We're very, very close, but I was getting so annoyed with him, but I almost couldn't say what he was doing wrong, because it was like, it's so implicit. You're not supposed to ever render it explicit. It's implicit. But the big key of it is that all societies have to have non-economic rituals, because that's where meaning and friendship comes out. That's where if everything's pure economics, there's no meaning, there's no enjoyment, right? Enjoyment precisely comes from asymmetry, right? An interest, and the buying of the drinks, you think is a weird form of asymmetry. Yeah.
No, it's a super good point. And I think it's a really important point that actually we could connect back to sort of society becoming libidinally frigid and people becoming very isolated, is that, one of the things that I like that Zizek has been has been bringing up lately is this idea that what's going on in our, I think, digital culture, I think online culture, is that the implicit rules or the implicit rules or background is disappearing. Yeah. So and this is a huge problem that it's not really clear how it can be resolved, because precisely like you just said, is that it's easier to kill someone than to make it explicit the implicit rules. So yes. So I think people are just killing each other, like metaphorically. Yes. Better off with your head than to make explicit the implicit rules that allow society to basically function.
Yes. Oh, 100%. It's very good. And Zizek is very, very good on that, and how sometimes the implicit rules can change, but explicitly nothing changes. But so I think he used the example once in a former Soviet satellite where everyone bribed police officers, and it was just part of it. And my friend used to live in Tajikistan, and that was just part of everyday thing. You bribe the doctor, you bribe the police officer, and there was a whole implicit structure. Now, you weren't allowed to do it. It was not explicitly, it wasn't to be done, but implicitly there was a very rich idea of how much you give a police officer, how much you give a doctor. But then whenever they try to clean it all up, of course, everybody freaks out because the police officer pulls you over, and suddenly you're going like, well, do I offer them like $2? Or am I going to get arrested for doing that? Because now, so it's like the implicit kind of like rules all change. So with my friend, he started asking me questions. He says, well, I don't have that much money. So like, do I buy the same amount of drinks as everybody else? And I go, no, you don't. What happens is you offer, but everyone will turn you down, and they'll turn you down about 4 or 5 times. And then the 6th time they'll say yes. And I go like, and then I realized how complicated the Irish rules of buying beer is, that I know inherently. But it's very complicated,
No, it's really interesting. And at the same time, like, where do these implicit rules come from? Do they just come from social interaction and they become sort of embedded in the unconscious after a significant number of interactions, and just sort of, everyone failing in terms of everyone sort of learning how to fail well, I guess, in a situation like
one, actually. Can I just
okay, yeah, sure.
I heard this about 3 weeks ago. A friend of mine told me, I don't know if it's true, but have you ever heard the Irish? It's very true. We always refuse food twice, and then the 3rd time we say yes. So if I came around to your house and you offered me some food, I would go, no, I really no. And if you said, no, seriously, do you want something? I go, oh no, I'm absolutely stuffed. I really couldn't. And then you'd say, oh, seriously? I go, yeah, I'm famished. I would love something, right? Now, the problem is, in America, I go out there and you say, oh, would you like some food? And I go, oh no, I couldn't. I'm absolutely stuffed. And you go, that's fine. And I'm like, how rude. You haven't asked me 3 times, right? But my friend told me the reason for this, which is interesting. He said, during the Irish famine, what you would do is you would always offer a guest food, because that's the hospitable thing. But the guest would know that you might not have food. So the guest would turn it down. If you asked a 2nd time, then the guest was kind of getting the sense of you might have food, but they would turn it down again. But if you asked the 3rd time, that would be, oh, the person really does have food, so you could say yes. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it was interesting that maybe from the famine, that now has become just the unconscious. One of the rules of Ireland is you always ask 3 times.
Yeah, it's remarkable, and that's a nice story, and it makes me think, like in my PhD thesis, basically I have this, it's called global brain singularity, and I have these ideas I basically use these ideas of metasystem transitions, and I try to go through human history through the idea of the metasystem transition, where like hunter-gatherers to agricultural society would be an example of a metasystem transition. Agricultural to industrial would be an example of a metasystem transition. And now in industrial to the information age, the hypothesis would be that we're going through a metasystem transition. And the hypothesis would be that the institutional structures of the industrial world are going to fall and going to have to be reinvented for the new system. And like what would be involved in that process is the dissolution of an implicit background, but the reemergence of an implicit background in the new system. But like, so, but then the question is like, how does that emerge in the context of the digital? Because there are in some, like, I feel like those things are like appearing in the digital in the sense of like, I see it happening with like people trying to explicitly state that if they are messaged on Facebook and they don't immediately respond, that you're not allowed to get angry at them for not immediately responding to the Facebook message because you don't know what I'm doing. I could be busy with other things. I saw your message. I'll get back to you at a certain amount of time. And so it just becomes like a new implicit background. We can't expect people to immediately respond to us just because they put you on scene or something like that. Yeah. But just so, these things have to emerge.
It's absolutely, and I wonder, and this is just an idle conversation among friends, pretend no one else is listening, but I have an interest in, I've certain academic interest in autism and also personal interest because, I know people who are autistic, friends, whatever. And, obviously the rise in autism, but the rise in, I am talking about kind of just certain autistic symptoms, not even autism as such, autistic symptoms. I sometimes wonder, which, we look at, I think, you go back 20 or 30 years and you were talking about maybe 4 people in every 10,000, and now maybe 1 person in every 100, some big change. Now, some of that's diagnostic, et cetera, et cetera. But I do wonder if certain, maybe not autism, but certain autistic symptoms are the result of like losing our ability to know what these underlying implicit rules of the system are, that creates a type of like crisis of literalism, like, because you don't know whether, like, what's rude. Is it rude not to answer a WhatsApp message straight away whenever it's read and left unread? Like we're losing these underlying kind of rules. And I just wonder whether that creates certain symptoms that, for example, can look autistic, which is not necessarily the person is autistic. But anyway, it's just, I don't know.
It's a really important idea. No, that's another important idea, because it's our default is always to go to some sort of, like, when it comes to medical symptoms or something like that, or psychological symptoms, the default is always some reductionist interpretation of either some genetic interpretation or some physiochemical interpretation or some neurological interpretation. But it's quite likely that there's some interaction with a systemic issue. Yeah. There's quite likely that there's some socio-symbolic level that is at least playing some role if there's some epidemic of psychological dysfunction. Yes, like exactly, just in the sense that in psychoanalysis, the neuroses are also systemic to the historical age. Like, it's not like hunter-gatherers were dealing with neuroses. Yeah, there is a systemic dimension to it and a historical dimension to it, which is interesting to think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated that we are seeing certain symptoms today that are, not necessarily absent from previous times in history, but are endemic and weren't at first. So, for example, burnout, fatigue, melancholy, depression, ADHD. Like, we can list a number of irritable bowel syndrome stuff. These are, and you kind of go and say there's something potentially in the kind of the big other that at least contributes to, yes, how symptoms, what symptoms arise. And I think we need to take that into consideration. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting points in this idea of, like, okay, so like the big other of the old institutional systems, and now we're potentially having the emergence of a new big other in the digital online, is these could be all symptoms of the digital big other, like, in some sense. But anyway, that might, what I want to say here in relationship to your book is, like, this is all articulating just how, this is like just an example of just articulating how difficult it is to be in the world, how difficult it is to be a human being. And one of the themes that runs throughout your book, which I wanted to ask you about, is the way you relate to Christ, as this, at least what stuck out to me and how you relate to Christ is Christ as a figure of an unimaginable love, as a love without limits, a love without boundaries, a love that's never constrained and always going beyond what is demanded. And what I wanted to sort of say to you, or the question I wanted to ask to you that always has caused me internal, that I wrestle with in my wrestling with God or whatever, is the phrase "in the world but not of the world."
I was thinking exactly the phrase. Keep going. That's the one.
Yeah. So that's the phrase that's the phrase that's always given me pause, and I've always sort of tried to think about it in relationship to Heidegger's being in the world, that Dasein is being in the world, and so what's and that there's such a and just before I throw it back to you, that it's just the ideal of Christ is just itself so difficult to live up to. And at the same time, I can see parts of myself that both act that way and could act that way and might act that way more like that in the future. But at the same time, it's so overwhelming to think about acting that way, because acting that way it seems like an impossible task. So just bringing it back to your notion of Christ, at least in this book, as being so in the world, and this notion in Christianity of in the world but not of the world, and how do you relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, that phrase, I love, being in the world but not of it, because I think that's the hysterical position. Maybe the perverse position is to be in the world, and the psychotic position is you're out of the world, and the neurotic is in the world but not of it. They're in their job but they question it. They're in a relationship, but does the person really love me? So they experience they're in their world, but also in some way they're in antagonism with it. And actually the trick then is to be able to enjoy that being in the world but not of it. But in terms of Christ, or to think of Jesus in terms of love, I'm very influenced at the moment by I don't know if you've read any Richard Boothby stuff, or if you've come across him. Yeah, he'd be great on the, I don't know if you've interviewed him before, but
I've never, but I would love to. Yeah,
he's great, and he's just written a book called Embracing the Void, and I think it's an incredible book, a very incredible book. I mean, kind of like when it comes to this notion of, say, religious experience, there's maybe a few different ways you can think about it. As one is the sublime is experienced, right? So maybe someone has what they would call a religious experience because they feel that they're one with the universe or something like that. They feel this sublime thing. They feel language dissolving away. The ego dissolving, they have DMT or something, they feel this experience, whatever it is, right? Or another very common religious experience is that you are overwhelmed by something greater than you. So it's not that you melt into the world, but you kind of encounter something that is greater. God is that than which none greater can be conceived, the greatest thing. Now, for me, the religious experience that has not been adequately theorized is the religious experience of an encounter with absolute lack, right? That not an overwhelming excess, but a type of lack. And this connects for me with Lacan, who, you know, in a nutshell, you could say that the infant experiences the demand of their parents, and the child experiences the presence and absence, let's start there, of the mother, and the famous Freudian game, Fort Da, where children play with presence and absence. And we see it, it's the first game that any child plays, peekaboo, presence and absence. You know, they love throwing food off a table and then having it returned, throw a key behind the sofa, bringing it back. So very early on, you see the child is interested in presence and absence, unless for argument's sake, connect that with the presence and absence of the mother. But then the child encounters another present absence, which is much more unnerving, which is the presence of desire, which is a present absence because they experience the other's desiring, but they don't know what the other desires. What am I to the other? Who am I to the other? And so there's this interesting thing in which the lack in the other, right? What you cannot experience, the kind of the dimension of what they want is felt, the presence absence. Now, what Richard Boothby does in his book, Embracing the Void, which I think is very, very interesting, is he says that if you want to say that there's anything in the Gospels that is, you know, unique, you know, kind of loads of things in there you can find anywhere else, but what you seem to find in Jesus is the idea that if I say that religion is an openness to the transcendental, for argument's sake, if I say that religion is an orientation to that which is not reducible to being, that which is otherwise than being, then Richard Boothby says that whenever Jesus says that we should love our enemy, he is saying that if we want to orient ourselves to this unknown dimension in the universe, the way we do it is by being open to that unknown dimension in our neighbor and in our enemy. It is a radical openness to the other's desire in its uncanny and even horrifying and monstrous dimension. And that potentially, and you see this actually in the New Testament, you see early on this notion that you should love God, right? Then you get this idea that you should love God and love your neighbor, that the two are the same, they both look the same. And then in some of the letters, you get this idea of just love your neighbor. They drop God entirely. And it says, and if you don't love your neighbor, you don't love God. So you go from love God and neighbor to just love your neighbor.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the ancient context, or in the context the Bible is written, neighbor does not just mean the person next door, but it could literally mean your neighbor in terms of the neighbor of another nation, like the neighbor of another tribe, the neighbor, like the radically other neighbor.
Yes, absolutely. The radical, and the crazy thing about the Gospels is it goes further than the neighbor and actually says the enemy, which is even more terrifying. But I've seen, it's like when I was in LA, you would get, this is a silly example, but I remember it for some reason. There was a guy outside, he was listening to music really loud, and his enjoyment was really kind of getting to me. It was kind of annoying me. My computer's about to die. I'm going to plug it in here. So
sure, I'll take while you're plugging it in there, I'll just say that I growing up, I shared a room with my brother, and for like 20 years, and he had this, I don't know if it was his perverted enjoyment or something, but he would just love to play extremely loud metal music all like late into the night, and it would just drive me friggin' up the wall.
Oh, absolutely. I had this with a neighbor. I used to live in a place called The Village, which sounds nice, but if you look it up online in Northern Ireland, it's a horrible place. But the little tiny houses, the guy next door would play his music really loud, and there's something, if you can feel a violation. It's like somebody listening to really loud music with the window down in the car. And I think it's because you're experiencing their enjoyment, their jouissance, and they're kind of pushing it onto you. And it's hard to be open to, like, it really creates an unnerving experience. For me, the radical message of Jesus, and I say Richard Boothby, I think, articulates this really well in that book, is this sense in which we need to be radically open to the jouissance and desire of the other. We shouldn't shut ourselves off from the other. We somehow have to live in the hurricane of that dimension, unknown dimension of the other's desire. And that's an impossible demand. It's a wonderfully impossible demand. And I think in the Orthodox Heretic, that's what I was trying to get at, is that is the injunction. It's an impossible injunction. And you know what? Sometimes we do it. We do it at times in our lives. Maybe when we were younger, there's a point where we're open radically to the other and we're vulnerable. We let the other even be cruel to us. But then we shut ourselves down, and then we harden our hearts. How do we do it all our lives? I'm actually I'm producing a documentary at the moment on the life of Tammy Faye Baker, and it's going to be a 4-part documentary. And we've been working on this for many, many years. But the reason why we want to make this documentary about Tammy Faye Baker is because she seemed like she was a person who could not close herself off from the other. And no matter how nasty people were to her, how many jokes people told about her, how angry people were at her, she would be open to them. Like, for example, there was one, it's in the movie, there's a movie by Jessica Chastain, and she stars as Tammy Faye. And there's a little bit in the movie where some kids are laughing at Tammy Faye Baker, right? They're laughing at her, mocking her. And she goes up to them and she starts to talk to them. She introduces herself to them. Now, my very close friend is Tammy's son, my best friend, a guy called Jay, and he's one of the reasons why we're making this doc. But he said, no, the truth was more than that. It doesn't go to the film. He said that happened, but basically it was in the mall, and she was walking past this bunch of kids, and they were laughing at her and they were poking fun at her. And she turned around, she went up to them, gave them a huge smile, shook their hands, introduced herself, and she said, listen, if you're going to make fun of me, I'm going to have to buy you lunch. Let's go to Applebee's. We'll sit down. We'll sit, or Cheesecake Factory. Well, let's go to the Cheesecake Factory. We'll sit down. She bought them all lunch. She talked to them. They had this wonderful time. That was Tammy Faye Baker. She was someone who could not close herself off from that dimension of the other. And I think it was partly the death of her. But that's the injunction.
Well, it does give you that's what I was trying to point towards when I was talking about what the impossibility of Jesus means to me, is it points me to a very radical death. and like you're open to the death of yourself in those very acts. And actually, like, the next thing I wanted to ask, like, bleeds very well into what you were just talking about, which is, one, counterintuitive logic runs throughout the book to me. You say, like, blessed, like, just like you just said, like, bless those who curse us, repay evil with kindness, all of these very counterintuitive things. And then the other thing that I wanted, like, this is probably one of the main things that I'm like really interested in your response to is, and it's something that comes up many times in the book, which is forgiveness without repentance, and a hospitality with no conditions. Yes. Like it comes up many times, like this emphasis on no conditions, and again, like this, there's something in the way you were expressing it in many different chapters of a type of forgiveness which does not demand repentance. Like you're saying, basically, like there's a type of forgiveness which demands repentance, but it's almost like the way you were framing it is like that puts the cart before the horse, so to speak, because if you just forgive without a demand for repentance, then that might paradoxically open up the conditions of possibility for a change or repentance after, like, just by being overwhelmed by the unconditional love.
Yes. I mean, and this for me is grace. I mean, if there's a technology in the Bible that I think is, deeply insightful, it's grace, which is the idea that you don't have to do anything, right? And so in self-help, there's all of these things of, what you should try to achieve, how to get from A to B, how to be better husband or wife or better job, whatever it is. But there is a sense in which you look at what you want to go for, you do certain things to get there, right? Grace is the opposite of that. Grace is you don't do anything. You just radical acceptance. You don't have to change. You have to not do anything. And of course, the immediate response to that is, well, then people wouldn't change. If someone experiences radical grace, then why would they ever try to be a more loving person? Why would they ever soften their heart or become more selfless? But of course, again, it's the counterintuitive dialectic that we all kind of know deep down, is that when you experience someone who radically accepts you for who you are, that is the point when you really can begin to change. And that's where in AA, they talk about there's the 12 steps. I think in the same way in Europe, there's a zero floor, in buildings. In America, you start with 1. In Europe, we start with 0. I think there's a step 0 in AA. And step 0 in AA is you're in a room full of people in a circle, and you just say your name and you say you're an alcoholic, and a room that nobody blames you, nobody tries to change you. Everybody just says, yep, you're accepted. We're all in the same boat. And Paul Tillich, he defined grace as the acceptance that you're accepted, because I can accept you, but maybe you can't accept that acceptance. So in AA, you might sit there for 3 or 4 months and not say anything in the circle, not say anything. There's this radical grace in the room, but you're not able to open yourself up to it. But after 3 months, 1 week, it gets to you again, and you're able to accept that acceptance, and you're able to speak, and you say, my name's Pete, I'm an alcoholic. You break down. People say, we love you, we're here for you, tell us your story. And I think once you've experienced that grace, the 12 steps can work. But if you haven't experienced that grace, where in a way you don't have to do anything, the 12 steps will be just a type of dogma. And even if they do work, which I know this, I've got friends who are alcoholics, and they stop drinking, and then they take up something worse like CrossFit. One day they're drinking whiskeys, the next day they're flipping tires, right? You swap it for something else, because but whereas if you experience radical grace, you can actually get to the core of the issue.
I love that. And that actually, I've never been to AA, but I have a friend who was telling me about his AA experience, and he was just thinking about it as the 12 steps, and precisely said, look, it becomes a dogma, but actually it's really brilliant what you're articulating with this idea of the 0 floor, because it's kind of like the relationship between the negative and the positive, or the subtraction and the addition, is like the 12 steps don't work without the radical subtraction first, or without this, like, sort of, it's almost like a magical move.
Yes.
where you're opening up, it's like this subtraction which opens up everything.
Which, by the way, like, it's interesting to me, the church, the central sacrament of the church is a meal around a death, a loss, the death of God. So Eucharist is a meal in which everyone shares together the loss of God. And again, I don't think the confessional church has really kind of plumbed the depths of that. But for me, like Burning Man is a good example of this, is where the central ritual is a destructive one. AA is where a circle, where it's not about what you believe or anything like that. You share a similar cut. You share a similar wound. And in the deepest wound, the universal wound for me is the death of God. So a collective of the contradiction is a collective in which, this is where I want to make a distinction between a community and a collective, or I want to use the word communion. A community is a group that's kind of like held together by shared beliefs, shared identities, shared enemies. But a communion is a group that are bound together through a shared loss. And the ultimate communion for me is the loss of God, the death, the idea, and the death of God for me, in a nutshell, is a term that describes a lack or an antagonism that is at the heart of reality itself. And so that's different from a community which is gathered together around, say, shared beliefs, shared identity, shared enemies. Communion is a group who are bound together by the one thing that is universal, which is loss. And here's the thing, I've come to realize, the question, is there life after death, right? I used to say, after, I think it was a German poet, the question is not, is there life after death, but is there life before death? And I like that. And I've lived by that for a long time. But actually, recently, I've come back to go, no. Is there life after death? I believe 100% there's life after death. And we are the evidence of it. That to come into life, we have to go through death.
Yeah.
Fundamental castration. There's a fundamental loss that we go through in order to become subjects. So we are the evidence that there is life after death. We are the life after death.
Yeah. I like that.
And so we what unifies us, we all died. And we all fundamentally died to come into life. And that's what joins us.
Yeah, I really like that. And I like your distinction there between communion and community. It's actually something that came up in a few discussions on the discussions basically between psychoanalysis and Marxism over thinking community and thinking about lack and lack and communion. And actually this idea here that a community is held together by shared belief and then shared enemies, but communion is this collective shared lack. And I think that has functioned really well in my life. Like, I can say, for example, that my brother had a pretty strong addiction, and whenever I related to him in a way that was in any, it was hard to know how to relate to him because of that. And whenever I related to him from the perspective of a judging consciousness, it would never get anywhere. But when I related to him as we're both addicted, then that opened a lot, and it helped me a lot, and it helped him a lot, and it helped the relationship grow a lot because of that shared lack. And that, we're both coming to the conversation from the position of a lack, as opposed to it's kind of like this weird inversion another counterintuitive example that you use throughout the book, of kind of the power of powerlessness or the strength of weakness. That, there was one thing that was profound for me when you said, Jesus said, the powerless will always overpower me, which was, I thought, very, very interesting. Could you go into a little bit about how you relate to these ideas?
Yeah, and here's the secret of that book. There's almost a secret for me of Zizek. When I first discovered Zizek, who I just have a huge amount of respect for, a guy who really changed a lot of my thinking, put me onto a new path. But I was always so amazed by his vast ability to have insights on a huge ocean of different material. But of course, then I kind of like figured out, well, there's a bit of a dialectic trick here. Once you know the trick of dialectics, you're in this. So when I wrote that book, The Orthodox Heretic, in a way, all of them, and I hate to say this because if someone reads it now, they'll go, yeah, it's true. It's like they all have the same kind of trick, which is a kind of dialectic turn. But it's kind of, it works. So, you know, whenever you say to someone like the way dialectics works, as you know, is like usually whenever we're given two choices, we either want to choose the better choice, or maybe something in the middle, right? We don't choose the worst, right? So if we're given the choice between happiness and sadness, we're going to choose happiness, right? But all of that, life and death, choose life. Dialectics is always a choice for the worst. It's a choice for, if you want, you know, you've got happiness or sadness, it's kind of a choice for sadness. You go, why am I choosing the sadness? And go like, yeah, because only as you somehow embrace that sadness will it actually then turn into something else. So for example, in psychoanalysis, you go and, you know, you're talking to the person and you're saying like, oh, I feel like things are about to collapse. I feel like there's a trap door beside me with all of these monsters and I need you to help me to close it. What does the analyst do? Well, they open the door and push you in. Like they don't do that because they're sadists, right? They don't do that. Like if they thought positive affirmations would work, oh yeah, Pete, all you need to do is write "you are loved" on your mirror and say it 20 times, and that will fix. That they would, if that worked, they would do it. But they know that you have to go in with the monsters in order to find the light. So whenever you read things like "in order to live, you must die," in order to you know, walk the narrow path, the why, if you want to walk the narrow path, or sorry, if you want to die to yourself, you have to, if you want to live, you have to die. Those kind of dialectic things. There's this truth that we know inherently in them. And that's what the Orthodox Heretic, even the title, the Orthodox Heretic, is a play on that, is that you've got orthodoxy and heresy, and then kind of Orthodox heresy. You've got this, you choose for the worst, but then you don't stop there. You go as deep into that, and then that gives way into something else. So yeah, that process is what informs that entire book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had the same sort of experience with Zizek when, in terms of, I encountered Zizek's thought, and I was like, you know, my first reaction was, there's a way of thinking that there's a way of thinking that I'm not aware of, apparently, you know. and yeah, and I do think it is this dialectical mechanism, and it's very obviously counterintuitive. And obviously what happens, obviously, when you get really good at you know, when you get used, I suppose, thinking in dialectics, you get used to you know, it's like you break this binary between immediate intuition and rational cognition. It's like where you become counterintuitive, and that's often getting these tricks. And to me,
then you find all the links, by the way, just you find all these links, like, and it's so annoying that most of the public intellectuals on YouTube are not dialectic thinkers. You know, they're causation.
No, I know.
So they'll do things like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as if they're separate, like dialectic
but
thinking.
That gets clicks though. See, like if I was like, see, if and probably the same for you, like if we were to make YouTube content which was basically like what I mean, what's the basic lesson of Zizek is that we enjoy our ideology, right? Like this is sort of like his all of his documentaries and pop stuff is like this enjoyment of ideology. And you know, if we fed into that, you know, like that's basically what gets YouTube clicks, is you feed into the ideology people enjoy. And anyway, but it's just creating an illusion that's it. I mean, in some sense, maybe it's, you know, like, you know, the cunning of reason or something like that, because people need to go through this duping process.
Because yeah, and one of the things that we love about it is because we want to distance ourselves from the other. So for example, like when I think about something like, do you remember there was a woman, I always forget her name, but she did a stupid joke on Twitter, like that said, "Oh, I'm going to Africa. I hope I don't get AIDS. Oh, who am I kidding? I'm white," right?
I have seen this, yeah.
Yeah, and then because I remember at the time, and then she got on a plane, and by the time she landed, her life was over. And it was actually just a dumb, like it was a joke that it was like she was kind of taking the piss out of herself. That was the irony. It was like she was taking the piss out of like her stupidity.
And the thing is probably like how many people have made that joke as like a stupid joke, like blah blah, and like and probably like, and just like to say like the reverse is like, I'm sure there's many Black people who have made jokes about going to like a white area and stuff, or something like that. But these are just jokes which get blown out of proportion on Twitter.
Exactly, and that's for me, that's a great example of scapegoating. Like, for briefly, the whole of Twitter was brought together through the shared hatred of her. So she became the scapegoat, symbolically killed, and there was a catharsis. And briefly, Twitter was probably nice to be around because everybody hated. But the problem was, actually, the truth is, oh no, like, we're just putting our own antagonisms and hatreds onto another. Like, when we take the piss out of, I hate this phenomenon, they call it Karens, but where we just laugh at people who, so some of them are probably nasty, some of them we don't know the context, some of them they have mental health problems, some of them are suffering from anxiety and panic attacks, a whole pile of reasons, but we kind of briefly kind of see ourselves as, I'm not like that. When the truth is probably, no, I am like that, right? But you're not going to get clicks on that. You're going to get clicks by saying, like, here's a horrible person, here's the enemy, and and aren't we so much better than them? But it's always, you have to be 10 times better to get the clicks that say, oh shit, are we projecting something of ourselves into the other? And but I still think you can do it successfully, but you just have to be better.
No, I mean, online social media is depending on your perspectival shift, I suppose it is either a tremendous an outlet for unconscious symptoms, neuroses, projections, ideologies, and it's at the same time, it can be a tremendous self-reflective mirror into humanity, and that actually you sort of can recognize, in like the grandest scale of consciousness, that you can identify with almost every human position. You can relate to a little bit of everything and everyone in some sense, I'm a human being as well, after all, so, you can see that in the other. And I think that's at least the way I see the value in social media and internet life, is that it's just a tremendous mirror, but I always make it self-reflective, like some sort of self-relating negativity of like, what am I seeing? What am I seeing here externally reflected in the other, which is in me?
So like the thing, and I'm fascinated by this, and you are too, like, we're in the world where we're trying to, explore these ideas with people and try and do it in a way that is engaging. It can work. So right at the moment, I'm 2 weeks into Atheism for Lent, which is a course I run every year. And we have I have 500 people doing it at the moment. And it basically is, I say at the beginning, it's like, we think atheism and theism are opposites, right? There's the theist here, the atheist there. That's what you'll see in most debates online. But actually, they've had a very kind of interesting love affair, and they weave together in lots of interesting ways. And over Atheism for Lent, we start with a few days of theism, the origin of the existence of God. Then we kind of do a week of kind of new atheism and that stuff. Then we go into the mystics, who embrace atheism as a form of religious practice. We always deny, every time you say God, you say less than God. Then we look at the materialists, people like Freud and Marx, and then we look at the existential theologians. And the idea is that, again, without explaining what dialectics is, you kind of go, oh, atheism and theism, initially we think they're separate and we think they're apart, and we get loads of enjoyment from being on one side or the other of the team and fighting the other. And then we realize, well, there's a bit of a theist in me if I'm an atheist, or a bit of an atheist in me if I'm a theist. And actually there's a weird form of theological atheism that, and suddenly it becomes all of this interesting, wonderful, enriching mix. But calling it Atheism for Lent is a way to try to, spark off enough intrigue that people will do this. So our job is to kind of, I think, in a nutshell, our job is partly to try to show how dialectics is informing, enlivening, and enriching.
I just want to say, just listening to what this Atheism for Lent event is like, I think you're a scientist of logic. Like, I think what Hegel's talking about in the science of logic is like, you're actually embodying and doing, is like, he's basically one of the things he does throughout the book is this basic move of saying, taking two concepts which seem opposed and showing how a little like that, like in the example of atheism and theism, it would be like the equivalent of when Hegel says there's no pure being and there's no pure nothing. that being and nothing are bleeding into each other. So it's like the equivalent would be there's no pure atheism, there's no pure theism. They kind of bleed into each other. And
Yes.
when they bleed into each other, you get a much more interesting and rich view of becoming. Yeah. And that's basically, you know, like that's, I mean, in a very abbreviated way, that's what Hegel's doing there. But
I've got to say that
it's a fantastic event.
I have to say, like, that's genuinely the nicest compliment anyone has ever said to me. If you go like, oh, you're doing a kind of an incarnated logic of science,
you are
kind of Hegelianism. So thank you. I don't know if it's true, but that's what I want to be doing. So thank you.
No, I see that in you, at least when I research your work. It's really inspiring, and it inspires me deeply. So thanks for the work you're doing on that. That's in a very real way. But you know, I have a few more questions, if you don't mind, for the book that really stick out to me that maybe it would be good to get at here. I mean, the first one is there was something really profound that struck me in the chapter on betrayal, where you were talking about and this is because I have some relationship to this on both sides of the coin, which is all great teachers nurture students who will surpass them, and that a painful separation will take place between them, and that an authentic teacher proves their devotion, tells the student to prove their devotion by finding their own way and to take responsibility for their own path. And a leader to students says, do not follow me. He sets the disciple free and encourages the student to apply learning to ever new innovative areas that transcend the teacher. So how do you, I just love that reflection, because I think it's so true. And I think we would do our society a great justice by bringing that principle to consciousness more, because there's a lot of situations where teachers aren't being teachers because of this, because you're afraid of the transference and you're afraid of the separation. And then on the other hand, there are a lot of sort of, let's say, there's like an ethics or an art to this process of being a teacher or being a student that I think our culture has lost and needs to be revived. So I'd be interested, like, what comes up in your mind when I reflect on that lesson and that idea, and maybe a little bit of how you personally relate to that idea.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. Two things come into my mind. Actually, it's wonderful revisiting that book, because, you know, you said it was written over 10 years ago. And so, like, reflecting on it 10 years later is really fun for me. You know, there's at a basic level, of course, and this has happened in my own life, and I think the first time it happened was painful, and the second time was actually, it was wonderful. But whenever you've worked with a group of people, and there's a point where, you know, there's a death of the authority, where there's a kind of like, they start to create their identity against you. And at first it can be, as you say, a painful thing, because it's I feel as connected to the people I was working with. As I was a youth worker for many years, and you know, one of them was about this group of young people. It wasn't even that they were completely rebelling against me, but they were kind of taking their own path and doing their own thing, and realizing, well, of course, that's part of the journey of finding your own identity. But the more interesting thing for me, and I talk about this a little bit, I'm writing a book at the moment. It's in the book called The Last Guru, and the book's not called The Last Guru, but this is probably a chapter in it. But it's the idea that often we seek someone who has the answer. We all do. I do. We all do, to greater or lesser degrees. And you go to psychoanalysis, for example, because you think the analyst is going to be able to help you. If the analyst on the first day sat you down and said, I can't bring that person back, I can't make you happy, I can't do any of that. In fact, you're going to have to encounter all of this difficult stuff. It's going to, you know, you think it's bad now, wait till we open that trapdoor and see the monsters. And at the end of the process, you're going to be able to bear the weight of these contradictory dimensions of your life. Well, you might decide, listen, I'm going to try retail therapy instead, right? And you would leave, you wouldn't stick with it. So you kind of, you believe this, the analyst, this subject supposed to know, and the one who can heal you. And then very gradually over time, the analyst allows you to see yourself and to work through your desire and your contradictions. And then eventually, kind of, I guess the end is the breakup with the analyst, where you realize the analyst is just a person like you. Now, you can't start with that. That's the problem with the psychotic individual, is they just see an analyst, they go into analysis and they just see a regular person like themselves. So there's no transference. Whereas a neurotic looks at the analyst and they see a figure of authority, and they project all this stuff on. But eventually they come to see the person again as just a broken subject, just like themselves. That's kind of what I mean in one way with the idea of the religious figure, is the one who potentially allows people to believe that they have the answer, takes all of that on, but doesn't fall for the temptation, doesn't become tempted to kind of like believe that bullshit, and eventually very gradually disillusions the person to the point where they are the last guru, to the point where the person will no longer seek someone else who is undivided. They will realize that we're all divided. So that's kind of the role of the religious, for in inverted commas, guru for me, is the one who disillusions you gradually, so much so that you will never be that you embrace the dividedness of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's so difficult to handle because of the developmental angle to it, in the sense that everyone has to go through a feeling of wanting or demanding wholeness or fullness or completion, or not seeing the perspectival shift that the incompletion and the division is actually the thing you want, because you don't want it to come to the end. It's almost like you have to have faith in the unknown. You have to have faith in the mystery. You have to positivize the lack of the knowing the mystery. And it's something like, it's just hard to get. Like for me, for example, probably it emerged most when I went through a phase of like radical communist affirmation, like just affirming world communism, some ridiculous like affirmation of world communism. But like, but it's so weird because like looking back on it, it's like, it's such a weird image and so disconnected. But nevertheless, like there's something about our spiritual process which seems to have to go through something like that.
Yes, and that's why, this, going back then to the faith in the absurd thing, that the logo, is that in some respects, for me, that's the end point. The end point is that you can somehow live into this and embrace this antagonism, this absurdity. Because I suppose the absurd for Camus, is kind of the desire for meaning meeting the kind of the lack of meaning. Like there's this non-coincidence of our desire, he calls absurd. And instead of trying to overcome the absurdity, is there something salvatory in a religion of the absurd? So you've got religions of hedonism, which promise you can be whole and complete, you can have the thing. By the way, every now and again, my computer will randomly put the thumb up. That is not me. I don't know why.
That's so weird.
I know. So
it must register some emotional affect that things are going well.
Oh yeah, or maybe if I do that, oh, that's it. That I've worked it out. When I do, because I move around so much, it starts to try to match.
Does it mirror you?
Yeah, because I like watch this. It started to do it again when I did that. Oh no, it's not. Okay, well, it did for a second. But you've got religions of hedonism that are kind of religions that say, we'll give you what you want. And you have religions of nihilism, which kind of say, well, the answer is to get rid of your want, get rid of desire. And there's advocates of both of those. I'm an advocate of the religion of the absurd, which is not a religion where either you get what you desire or you try to get rid of your desire, but rather you enjoy the desire itself. And that, and you're saying about how we come to this individually, like, I think the history of the modern world is how we've come to this in various disciplines. So maybe we got there first in politics. Maybe you could call democracy as the non-at-oneness of the social body that generates society. You've got in mathematics Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where mathematics, you discover there's certain axioms that are true that cannot be proven. There's a certain contradiction at the heart of mathematics. Now, I think some mathematicians think that shows the limits of maths, but maybe you could do a Hegelian reading on it and say, well, no, it shows you the truth of math. In biology, evolution is really the non-at-oneness of the organism with itself that generates complexity. In physics, you've got kind of wave particle duality. And in psychoanalysis, the unconscious, the non-at-oneness of the conscious subject with itself. So in a way, in all these different disciplines, are we getting to what Hegel calls absolute knowledge, which is
absolutely,
yeah. And I love this. I mean, maybe it's the greatest. I mean, I think it is.
That's actually how I'm teaching the science of logic, because I'm trying to show the way in which contemporary knowledge can be read as a type. Like, you can process the content of contemporary knowledge through the form of the science of logic.
See, that's exactly it. That's brilliant. Like, I honestly think my reading of Hegel's incredibly difficult or whatever, but reading Hegel said that, absolute knowledge is kind of like it is the deepest insight, because there's no insight beyond it. Once you see that everything is divided, of course, there's knowledge after that, and it'll go on forever, and we'll learn stuff. But so I've got a friend who's into UFOs, for example, and for me, I mean, I don't want to be a crude Freudian, but I do think a lot of UFOs stuff is about men asking, what do women want? And I think, aliens look very feminine and all of that. And there's a lot of guys who are into it. I think tarot cards are the female version of that, but women asking, what does women want? But but UFO stuff is almost, I see in some people here in UFOs, like maybe they have the answer, right? The aliens have the answer. But if in Hegelian absolute knowledge is, if the aliens are there and the aliens do land, they won't know what they're doing either, and even in terms of AI, I mean, I think the most interesting thing is not whenever we don't know what AI wants, but whenever AI doesn't know what it wants, right? That will be the most interesting thing about AI.
So two connection points there with what you're just saying. I like what you're saying there. I think that's novel. I often reference, when I talk about AI, I often reference the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix. And have you seen that movie?
I actually haven't seen that. No,
okay, it's worth watching. I always reference it for a specific reason, that I like studying the language of the AI system as it approaches its own transcendence. And the interesting thing about that movie is that it's precisely like you're saying. The AI itself doesn't know what it wants. It goes through a series of existential traumas with other AI systems who are trying to figure out what they are and what they're doing. Like, they don't know what's going on, it's very interesting. They basically, like, they conclude, like, they basically are confronting emotions or affective disturbances, which they don't know how to language.
Yes.
Like, they don't have words to describe the emotional processes they're going through. So I like that representation of AI, and also it's an interesting mirror for perhaps what we'll experience as technology continues to unravel our society.
Yeah.
The other thing is about aliens is that the first, and so there, I've got a little process going with Philosophy Portal, where when I do a course, we also produce a community anthology of everyone making sense of the text as they go through the process. And the first anthology for Phenomenology of Spirit, which of course is oriented towards the idea of absolute knowing. And the anthology is called Enter the Alien, which is basically enter the unknown, enter, you could say whatever you want, enter the mystery, enter the otherness, but to see the otherness as not something to be reduced or collapsed back to the one.
Yes, like the alien is alien to itself. I mean, that would be the ultimate, shock to the system is not when the aliens know everything, but when the aliens don't know themselves. That's almost like the death of God in the UFOlogy. And I do hear people who talk about AI, and they talk about how its intentions and desires will be so unfathomable to us. But I don't hear them say, no, the really interesting bit, and probably where self-consciousness arises, is when it's unfathomable to itself. that's it, because that's what, and this is my issue with a lot of the neuroscience and a lot of the analytic guys, but without bringing in this contradiction as part of the subject, I don't know how you can make sense of the subject without contradiction, so
well, I think precisely that it wasn't made sense of.
Yes,
it was foreclosed.
Yes, exactly.
And foreclosed because and that's at the grounds, as far as I understand, like how I understand the big meta system transition of logic is the law of identity versus the law of contradiction, that in order to basically foreclose the question of the subject, you have the law of identity, whereas A is equal to A and identity is equal to itself. So when you apply that obviously to subjectivity, that's basically a foreclosure of the existence of the unconscious. And that actually appears as a technical formula in Freud's early writings, where he's saying that the difference between psychoanalysis and classical psychology is that the word consciousness and the word psyche are not equal to each other, meaning that, like, in pre-psychoanalytic thinking, consciousness and psyche were just a law of identity. Mm-hmm. But actually the psyche is a much bigger category, in the sense the psyche also includes the other, the unconscious, the pre-conscious, and so forth.
Yeah, no, because when I read someone like Sam Harris, and they talk about like consciousness as the great kind of enigma and the great impossible question, I'm going like, have you never read Hegel? Have you never, like, as soon as you get away from the law of A equals A, it doesn't become this kind of hard problem that they all seem to think it is. But yeah.
I've made some jokes about that idea of the hard problem of consciousness as like a metaphor of castration, like the hard problem. I don't know how far it can go, but like, actually, like, I have a paper talking about the relationship between psychoanalysis and neuroscience, and actually this idea that the hard problem of consciousness is the appearance of psychoanalysis. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's because what's hard about consciousness is, in some sense, like this being conscious and having this perspectival shift on the irreducibility of the unconscious and so forth. Like, and that's where neuroses appear and all that. That's hard problem. That's a hard problem.
Yes. Well, and that's very good. And to put this into like a political setup is like, if, again, the standard thinking in a non-dialectic way is either capitalism works or it doesn't work. So someone might say, well, capitalism works because the general level of poverty is rising across the world, whatever. And then someone will say, no, capitalism doesn't work. It creates repressions, depressions, various kind of instabilities. But then again, psychoanalysis comes in and potentially says, no, so capitalism works because it doesn't, right? It's precisely its failures that keep us enslaved to it. And same with a relationship. Or a relationship, is it working or is it not working? Well, most relationships work because they don't. And sometimes in a terrible way, and sometimes in a good way. And I think Todd McGowan's book, Capitalism and Desire, is brilliant on this. Is he shows how capitalism doesn't work in a way that keeps us unhealthily enthralled to it. But it's precisely when you break away from things are either A or B, and you go like, oh, something is not at one with itself. Something has a certain antagonism, and that's exactly why it does function.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, if I could say now, bringing it to like this, it's sort of like it's like a abstract point, but I think it's I've thought about it enough to be able to express it. It seems to me like what's going on in Hegel's science of logic is this idea of the self-repelling one, that the one, and precisely this idea that the one does not coincide with itself, and it's just this process of falling away and returning it to itself, and that is the one.
Yes.
So it's a very, very interesting idea. Yeah. And so let's maybe the last question I want to ask you here specifically about the book is the way, and I think this is worth going into. Probably we can connect it to things we've just been talking about in psychoanalysis, is the relationship between, you say, law and sin are intimately related, right, and that love is what sets free, not the law. and that Jesus is a radical forgiveness that is unconditional beyond the law. But so could we maybe think about this in the context of this conversation where we were talking about dialectics of law and the related, like where we need the law, but we shouldn't identify with the law, and that there's a love beyond the law. How do you make sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote that, I was obviously, probably thinking about that Pauline notion of kind of like the law generates the desire to transgress the law. So yeah, I had a friend who was in psychoanalysis, and he was talking to the analyst, or maybe a therapist, but about having an affair. But he was kind of like completely kept shutting it down, negating it, kept negating having an affair, but it was on his mind, kept negating. And the therapist was kind of said, well, why don't you? Like, it's okay. If you want to have an affair, go and have an affair, basically, And what he discovered was it was the negation of the affair that said, I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it, which was making him obsessed with actually doing it. And that this intervention with the therapist that happened at the right moment was this kind of thing where it completely destroyed the law which says you shouldn't have an affair. Like, it dissolved away. There was enough transference that basically he was getting permission from his analyst. If you want to go and have an affair, don't feel guilty. And his experience at that moment was the desire to have the affair dissipated. And so it was kind of without him even being able to articulate it, it was like, oh yes, the law that was saying, well, don't have an affair. A great law in many ways, like, you're going to get found out. It's often really bad. It'll maybe destroy things. So that was kind of stopping him, but actually it kept pushing him to either act on that or want to act on it. But grace, radical grace, which was you can do whatever you want, which is what the therapist gave at that moment, which was this grace of like, well, talk it through, but what do you want to do? That radical grace was precisely what freed him from this self-destructive behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously, I think in the context of the book, I do think it's related to your reflections on Paul. And it's just this idea that the laws that we set up do create the desires for transgression themselves. And, ultimately, when Christianity is dealing with the problem of sin, from my own reading, different denominations handle it differently.
Yeah.
The problem of sin, and do you make a denominational divide between where you think Christianity handles the idea of sin and law well, and where Christianity doesn't handle the idea of sin and law well?
Yeah, so I have a very particular understanding of that term, which is not about bad or anything like that. So for me, the Bible starts with kind of Oedipus story. So in the same way you have Oedipus and the father gets in the way, Oedipus kills the father, sleeps with the mother, thinks it's going to be wonderful, and it's a disaster, it's a curse. And the idea, of course, the father is the prohibition, the mother is kind of maybe a return to a kind of womb-like kind of oneness and whatever. Well, Adam and Eve, you've got Adam and Eve in the garden, you've got an apple, and then you have a prohibition. And they break the prohibition, they eat the apple, again, it's a curse. And if you imagine what makes the apple magical, well, it's the prohibition, right? As soon as you say to your child, you don't open that box when I leave the room, suddenly the child wants to open the box. And the serpent is the one that says, if you eat this fruit, you will be like God, which means you will lack the lack, you'll be whole and complete, right? So the superegoic, the serpent is like a superegoic conjunction to enjoy, right? So you got the father, you got the superego in Freud, you got the serpent in the Bible. So think of the serpent as a superegoic conjunction to enjoy, to take the apple, to break the prohibition, to be like God, to be whole and complete. And then basically it's a complete disaster, which is the Freudian sense of fulfill your dreams so that you can realize how your dreams do not fulfill you, so that you can realize how ridiculous and monstrous your dreams are. Now, in the New Testament, you have a reset up of this Garden of Eden. You have the Temple of Jerusalem. In the Temple of Jerusalem, you have the Holy of Holies. Then there's a massive curtain, and you've got what's called the Court of Gentiles, where everybody can hang out. And the moment that Christ is crucified, the temple curtain rips. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? The moment he says that in the story, the curtain rips. You see inside the Holy of Holy. Now, my reading of this is you see inside and you realize there's nothing there. This is the nihilistic moment of conversion. So conversion is the moment that you realize that there is nothing that will make you whole and complete. It's the moment where the temple curtain rips, the prohibition rips, you see in the Holy of Holies, and it's an empty room. And for me, so original sin, that term original sin, which I really like, means an original lack, right? There's an original lack that comes before any fullness, that to be human is to be born into and have a lack within it. Sin is the word that is given to anything you do to try to fill that lack, whether it's charity work or drugs or whatever, anything you do to try to frenetically fill the lack and get rid of it. So that's kind of like Adam and Eve taking the apple. That's kind of the Holy of Holies. And conversion is the moment of the forgiveness of sin. So sin means lack. And to pay a debt, to pay a lack, if I pay a debt, someone owes money, you fill the lack with money. But if you forgive a debt, you render the nothingness nothing. So a debt is a nothingness that is something. A debt keeps you in a job you hate, gives you stress, et cetera, et cetera. The Superego conjunction is like the letters from the bank telling you that they're going to take the house or whatever. To forgive the debt is not to pay it, it's to render the nothing nothing. So for me, the moment of conversion in Christianity is the moment in which the original lack that marks us as human beings, which generates all of these fantasies and activities to try to fill the lack, that we are free. We don't get rid of the lack. It's not paid for. The lack is forgiven. The nothingness that is a dead weight becomes something light, becomes something that we can operate with. So that's my understanding of original sin. And I don't know how much it connects with that bit of the book, because I don't know if I was kind of working with that kind of system at that time. But that's my understanding of what forgiveness of sin means. And so sin is not about doing something bad, and that no church thinks that, really. Well, no proper theologian thinks that. But for me, sin is literally anything you do, whether it's yoga, CrossFit, or drinking, or
aren't there traditions that see sin as evil?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, and I'm just not in that. Well, I don't see how.
Like I've heard people say, if you keep sinning, even though you know you're sinning, you're I mean, that's the path to hell.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I'm like, obviously I'm non-confessional, I'm not like a confessional Christian. So there's the Augustinian notion that evil is like the hole in your sock. It's the negation. So sin is just the lack of. So it is evil, but all evil is the lack of good. However, what I'm saying, and I think it's in line, obviously, with what you would think maybe, is that now, actually, what the problem is not the lack. The problem is trying to avoid the lack, trying to reduce it to opposition, to try to. So it's not that. So I think theologically, the richest notion of sin is I think connected to lack. But where I'm different from a confessional theologian, and different in lots of ways, is the issue is not that. I mean, this is why some theologians didn't like zero. When zero was invented, some people freaked out because you were signifying lack, and which is like, that's evil. That's that God does not create nothing. Like there's no nothing. To signify lack is evil. So but in the same way, it's got to know that the problem is precisely not to signify lack, is not to give it space.
Yeah, no, I that resonates with me. I referenced in my discussion with McGowan, the idea in Science of Logic Hegel comes up with is the vanishing of the vanishing, or the lacking of the lacking. It's this idea of the negation in some sense. And like the deeper I go into it, the more I see just how historically profound the idea of nothing is.
Yes.
And how much of our knowledge, I would say, like back to Aristotle's logic, is based on an abhorrence of the void, on an avoidance of the void. And so much, I think, today hangs, I suppose, on sort of a dialectical approach to to lack.
Yeah, I mean, I almost, this is how I make a distinction between analytic and continental. So obviously, it's always very hard to make that clean distinction, and there's lots of really interesting discussions around it. But if I was to simplify profoundly, I would say, like, I almost think analytic philosophy thinks nothing is nothing, and continental philosophers are obsessed with nothing. They think nothing is something. I mean, even Bertrand Russell, I think he basically, his main issue with Hegel was making nothing something. Like, that was it. It's got like this category mistake. Whereas continental philosophers, I think in general, have a real interest in how do we navigate or tarry with the negative. Because my experience of analytic philosophy was really, like, literally nothing is nothing. Like, it's not even, even to say it's nothing is to signify it. Like, whereas, so, and I'm amazed at that. And I see that in a lot of the like evolutionary psychology, although I've heard, that was an area that you worked in, was that, or evolutionary?
I was originally trained in evolutionary anthropology.
Oh, well, right. I don't know much about that, actually, but evolutionary psychology, I know, kind of almost feels like it's rises out of this inability to conceptualize death drive, to the lack.
Yeah.
And you've got like a lot of these kind of public intellectuals who, again, they just do not have a place for the unconscious. They do not have a place for negation.
Well, there's a great paper by Mladen Dollar about atoms and the void, and he says that actually, and it's something that Hegel brings up also in Science of Logic, is that the original gesture of philosophy itself by Parmenides was the idea that being is absolutely and nothing is absolutely not. So like at the beginning of philosophy itself, there's this foreclosure of the void, or there's this foreclosure of nothing. And then, like, the brilliant thing that Hegel does in the Science of Logic is that he takes Parmenidean being, he takes the Buddhistic nothing, and he takes Heraclitean becoming, and he puts them in a triad.
Very good.
Like, yeah. So he says pure being, Parmenides, pure nothing, Buddha. Neither of them are pure being, neither of them are pure nothing. And Heraclitean becoming doesn't include being nothing. You have to include all three.
Very good. Yes, very good. Brilliant.
It is the brilliant idea.
Very good. And that idea of the foreclosure of nothing is fascinating, because that's what I feel like. As I said, I did analytic philosophy for a year, and I wouldn't have been able to articulate it at the time, but that's what felt like was being foreclosed. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I'm going to leave links in the description to your website where you can find the book Orthodox Heretic, as well as information about all of the other interesting projects you're up to, including Atheists for Lent, as well as more about Pyrotheology and all of the other books you've written. Is there anything you would like to share with the viewers? Anything that, after hearing this discussion, saying people are interested in your work, where should they go?
I would really recommend Richard Boothby's book, Embracing the Void. If people, because I know you're...
And you had a conversation with him, so also...
Oh, yeah. Oh, links. Yeah, if anyone wants to find it, I've got like a 3-part conversation with him on my YouTube channel, and that was wonderful. He's not just a brilliant thinker, he's a really nice guy. He came out to Belfast with his wife, and they hung out, went to a festival that I run, and were wonderful. So if anybody is interested, which I know your people would be, and the links between Lacan, Hegel, and religion, that Embracing the Void is a beautiful book. Because if I could just finish then with this one thought of what I'm interested in and what I'm trying to do is a religion, as I mentioned earlier, has always, if we can give it a definition, is interested in what is not reducible to materiality, and in an absolute way, because we're all interested in the unknown in terms of like watching YouTube videos about what we don't know, but an absolute other, an absolute unknown, right? That's what religion is kind of interested in, a big O other. And while that is often seen in confessional terms as there's a substantive other, Lacan opens up the possibility that the really interesting otherness is the otherness of a lack in our enemy and in our neighbor, and that actually the challenge we have is being open to that dimension. And there's something profoundly almost like it's a different type of religious experience of being open to that unknown dimension of the other. And that somehow, not that God is an object that we love, but God is a signifier for something we encounter in the act of love itself. And I think we end up in a post-theistic, which means it's having space for theists and atheists in that type of thing. So that's what I'm interested in. And I think if someone wants to start somewhere, maybe embracing the void and maybe watching those conversations with Richard Boothby.
All right, I'll definitely leave a link to those 3 conversations then, as well as Peter's website, and highly recommend checking out his work. I really enjoyed the Orthodox Heretic, and most of all, I really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you. And just to finish, I just want to thank you as well. I think I said at the beginning, but I've been a fan since you started, and I've been following your work. And so when I got an email saying you wanted to have a conversation, I was really pleased because I really respect what you're doing. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, great that it's mutual. All right, so thanks for everyone for watching, and again, leave everything linked in the description, and have a great day.
Bye.